Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Bionicle Inspiration series, the series where we cover mocks from the community to help inspire you to build some cool stuff in the future. So this episode is on Turaga, basically the old guys from the Bionicle universe. So pretty much when a Toa reached the end of his journey, he finished his destiny, he achieved what he needed to achieve, he could change form into a Turaga, a wise, noble being, and we're going to be covering some mocks that are Turaga. So, let's begin. Remember, before we begin though, you yourself can submit mocks or theme ideas, or just give a little bit of critique about the episode, but more on how to do that at the end of the episode itself. So, let's begin. The first mock we have today is by Rockmonster 2000 and is called Tribal Turaga. I really like this mock. There's something very cool about it, is that it obviously is a Turaga, but it's kind of got a very unique take on the Turaga. It's, as the title suggests, it's a tribal Turaga. A lot of the designs, like using some of these really cool plant element pieces and even some of these white horns and stuff, which kind of look a bit like bone or something, gives it this really nice tribal effect. And I think there's some really clever and surprisingly simple ways that it's achieved this. One being the mask choice. Surprisingly, I never even noticed it, but the Vizon head flipped on its what was supposed to be the Mask of Life side looks surprisingly tribal-like. Looks like some sort of, tribal mask of some kind, something cool. And combining that with other elements, like I said, like those sort of bone claw pieces or these cool leaf parts, you get a surprisingly nice-looking tribal effect. And it's funny because you could easily not have included any of those parts, and it still would have been a very effective, nice-looking Turaga. But just those subtle, nice little details like that really improve the mock and help to expand upon it and create a very clever, unique concept. And so I think that's cool, is to kind of branch out and use, whether they're system parts or Bionicle parts, any part really that's sort of, more of like a specialty piece, I guess you could call it. And add a little bit of extra detail. See if you're able to branch out and use a slightly different concept in some manner. Another thing that's really cool is these weapons that he has. One of them's this sort of really cool staff using some of these brown connector parts there. And then at the tip, he's got a Chima crystal at the top there. And it's cool. It seems like a very old sort of important artifact, like got some sort of historical value behind it. It's obviously old, much like he is, and having the crystal up there, I don't know, it kind of paints a bit of a story, and I think that's really cool. And even cooler because obviously most of the Turaga depicted in current Bionicle lore are very, wise, noble, they're leaders, that sort of thing, and they often have a fair bit of history surrounding them. So it's cool that the weapon kind of reflects that in a sense. The weapon almost sort of seems to tell a story. The weapon has history itself. So that's really cool. Another thing that I think is really cool is the idea of a tribal Turaga. Actually seems very Bionicle-y. Bionicle-y, if that's a word. But it very much fits within that world. There's all these guys living on an island, and it's a tropical island to some degree, And you could argue aspects of, because obviously Bionicle is inspired by the Maori language and other aspects of that, and you kind of could argue that, maybe there's some stuff that you could learn from that. Maybe do a little bit of research into the culture and the language and all sorts of stuff like that. Who knows? There might be concepts or things in there that inspire you or relate to a Bionicle in some way that you can expand upon and put into something. For example, there's a surprisingly large amount of parallels between Moana and Bionicle because of the Maori language. So, I don't know. That's maybe something to look into, something that can you can get some really unique and oddball, but really, really nice ideas from. Who knows? Anyway, that's it for Rock Monster. Let's move on to the next mock, which is by Lois Nuva and is called You Are the True Hero, and Your Legend Is Now. So this mock was inspired by an artwork made by Christian Faber, and was put on a forum known as Bionifigs. I believe it was for the 10th anniversary of Bionicle, or the 10th anniversary of the blog forum place. I'm not too sure, actually, but here is the cool picture. Looks awesome, and you can obviously see, looking at the mock and looking at the picture, the very direct parallels. Essentially, this mock is just a recreation of that photo, and that's really cool. So maybe you can do that. We've talked a fair bit about this on the page already, the Bionicle art book. Why not take a look at some of the artworks in there, because some of them are absolutely beautiful, and there's some paintings and drawings in there that were meant to be Bionicle sets. So why not see if you can recreate those in actual Bionicle form? See what you can do, or even if it isn't a Bionicle related artwork. look at some concept art, look at some character designs, and maybe see if you can recreate the image or the character that's depicted in that. And you could either do like this and just build the figure that's pictured, or you could also do like this and build the figure and the landscape pictured and literally recreate the photo. So I'll talk a bit about the landscape first, and then we'll get onto the Turaga in the image itself. Very, very cool. There's always a sort of classic Bionicle trope, was having some sort of mask be sort of lost in a bunch of sand. So seeing the Vahi like that, sort of resting on this sand here, whether it's in the picture or in the mock itself, it's just very, very cool. Very, very Bionicle-y. It's very awesome. Also really interesting to see the landscape zoomed in the sort of recreation of the picture, and then the landscape zoomed out when you see the whole mock. It's interesting that it's got this really nice border, looks great, and the way that the sand is sort of layered looks very sort of desert-like and awesome. It's really cool to see all these sand dunes and things like that, and even cooler to see a mock placed directly in that. It's really helps sort of paint the picture and expand upon it more. Always cool when people sort of add a little bit of a diorama to go with a mock. So if you've got the parts, if you want to play around with it, maybe that's something to try. And something else that I think is really fascinating is he said in the description here that he could have used other types of slopes, different sizes, different shapes and stuff, but he had some constraints, and so he made some choices. And that's totally fine. Nothing wrong with that. If you're limited on parts, just see what you can do with them. And something else that I think is really cool about this as well is there's a very unique shape and a very unique texture that's created by literally just using 1x2 Lego tan slopes to create this sort of sand dune effect that we see on the diorama here. It's very unique. Obviously, like he said, if you played around with different shapes and sizes, well, you would have got a slightly different result. But I think that's really cool because, hey, you could just log on to Bricklink, place an order for 400 slopes, less than that, more than that, whatever you're planning on doing, and you're set. You only need to use those for the diorama, which is more or less what this has done, except for, some other parts, where there's some other pieces and things like that, but the bulk of the diorama is just ordering bulk of one part. So maybe that's an interesting way to build a diorama if that's something you're interested in. Or maybe you can even do that with one Bionicle. Who knows? Anyway, let's touch a bit upon the Turaga itself. Looking at the reference image, we can see that the staff of the little Toa Turaga guy, no, I suppose he's not a Toa, he is a Turaga, this is the Turaga episode. The Turaga in the background there, his staff, it is the classic Bionicle symbol of unity, duty, and destiny. Very, very cool to sort of see that on a staff there. Again, very Bionicle-y, very cool. And interesting to see a very simple translation of that into Lego form, just putting those Exoforce hands connecting like that in a circle. Technically, it's an illegal technique because they're not supposed to connect like that, and it probably does put a bit of stress on the parts, but that's not so bad. It still looks cool, and it's a decent enough way to match that symbol. I think that's really clever and really unique. Again, it kind of plays upon what I was saying in the last mock of taking some inspiration from Bionicle itself, or some of the inspirations for Bionicle, anything like that, and looking into using some elements like that. Maybe you can use, the unity, duty, destiny symbol in whatever you do, or, other aspects, other symbols, other relics of the past with Bionicle. Maybe you can somehow incorporate that into the mock in some fashion. Could be fun, could be cool. Also really cool to see that staff. It's just sort of made out of those lightsaber parts from Ultra Build sets. It makes a very surprisingly nice looking staff. It sort of has this kind of rustic, older look to it, and it very much differentiates itself from the rest of the mock. It's very, very cool. Also cool to see a custom cape being used there. Looks great. Great way to kind of cover up the torso there, but also add a really nice sort of desert wanderer kind of effect. It just looks nice. Again, as well, we've got a very sort of simplistic limb design with this. They're very, very thin. They don't use a huge amount of parts, but it works very well. It matches the source material to some degree, gets the job done, and just looks good. Doesn't use too many parts. It's always a pleasure to see something like that. And speaking of always a pleasure to see something very nicely done is the mask design here. Now, it's obviously made pretty much entirely out of system parts. It's a very nice way to sort of branch out and make your own custom mask design, because maybe the masks that Bionicle has made just don't cut it for you, and you really want to sort of play around and do something specific. Or maybe it's time to break out some of your smaller system parts and play around, see what you can do, because if you're able to create a nice custom mask purely made out of system, you get some really nice results and some really unique designs. Anyway, that's it for Loz Nuva. Very, very nicely done, good sir. Let's move on to the next mock, which is by Unuku. And now this mock is very exciting. It's called Kazi. Now, technically, it's Toa Kazi, Matoran Kazi, and Turaga Kazi. Now, as we said at the start of the episode, obviously, Turaga begin their lives as Matoran, they become Toa, and then they become Turaga. And this mock covers all of that, which is awesome. Very, very cool. Always a pleasure to see a mock sort of transition throughout that journey. So that's really cool. So it's awesome to see sort of little elements that have continued across. And I definitely encourage people to do that. What a fun idea to build a mock and build it in all 3 stages of its life. Or maybe you've got a mock that you currently have. Why not build it as it was as a Matoran? Or if it's a Matoran currently, build it as a Toa. Or maybe it's time to make them a Turaga. Who knows? Who knows? Play around, see what you can do. So here's some really unique concepts that this mock explores, transitioning through those 3 stages. So let's start with the Matoran. We see here he's used some mixel joints because obviously it's a smaller shape in general, so it's a good way to kind of get a lot of detail and really pack in everything that you need to on a smaller design here. Also using some of these, I don't know what you'd call them, but they're sort of L-shaped, these connector pieces here on the hands. It's a great way to make posable hands on such a small mock. It's a effective and very nicely done design there. Very, very cool. So then we transition to the Toa design, and we can see some elements that have transpired across the mock. So for example, the chest design here, we see that trans blue element being continued on. Looks great. Awesome to see all this sort of detail under it too, using some system parts and some gears and things. Again, very Bionicle-y, seeing all that sort of detail there. That's awesome. It's also really cool because on the Matoran, the top of the arms were light grey, and then we see that again here. And we also see that they're still semi-skinny. There's nothing covering it. It's just a bare CCBS bone there. And I think that's very, very cool. Very, very clever to see that even sort of the shape of the mock itself is carried across. And that's sort of the same thing with the Rakshi legs here. There was a system plate there before, so elements are being carried over or expanded upon slightly, and that's really cool. And one little lovely little detail there, the staff on the Toa here almost sort of seems to resemble one of the Rakshi weapon pieces, and it's sort of recreated in system. Very nice way to do it, very, very nicely done. And so then we move on to the Turaga, and again, we can see some of those elements reoccurring. The top of the arms have no armor on them. The legs sort of continue to have that sort of big splatter of white, and we've got the blue on the chest there, and then as well, the cape that was sort of wrapped around his waist now becomes a sort of not waist cape, sort of like a cape, I guess, that a Turaga would normally wear. And it looks really good. It looks very Turaga-like, very awesome. Now, of course, both of those capes, whether it was the Matoran or the Turaga, are custom capes, to my knowledge. But you could use like a Rey cape or pretty much any of the current capes that you get in any sort of current CCBS Star Wars set. See what you can do, see what you can play around with. It's a very, very nice idea. Also cool to see this smaller staff here using some lightsaber rods and hilts and things like that to create a very nice looking Turaga staff. Again, fairly similar to the staff that we saw on the Toa. And now something that I really, really like about this, when it becomes the Turaga, he has an entirely new, different mask. Obviously, the mask continued across from Matoran to Toa, but now it's changed. And if you look, for example, at any of the Toa Metru, who then became the Turaga that we saw at the start of Bionicle in its early years, their masks, of course, were fairly different, but maybe a little bit of a nod to some of the original masks that they would have had. So I think that's cool, is to if they become a Turaga, well, would they keep the same mask? Would it change slightly? Would it evolve because, technically they've got older? That's just sort of the way that Turaga work. Their masks change. It's a nice idea. And that mask, to a degree, almost sort of looks like a more sort of noble, older version of the mask that he had as a Toa. So it's very nice sort of continuity there. Very, very cool. So nice work, Anuku. Let's move on to the final bonus mock for this episode, and then we will round off the episode as a whole. We have a mock by Jacopo Genovis. Now, this was submitted over on my Facebook page, so he sadly did not include a name, but we're just going to call him Turaga. So, when he sent me this mock, he was saying that he doesn't really have much access to any CCBS parts, so he built this using the pieces mainly from a Borok, Turaga Motatu, and some other stuff that he had around, a couple Toa Nuva, all sorts of things like that. And I think he achieved a very nicely designed, well-built mock. And it's a really nice reminder that, hey, if you don't have huge access to parts, you've only got a couple sets, you don't have a huge parts pack or anything to work with, you can still achieve a really nicely designed mock. And even playing around with some older parts and some older designs and older concepts, again, you can still achieve a nice mock. Some people would argue that, that's not a good mock because it uses techniques from 2004. Ugh, you should make techniques from 2018 because it's 2018, man. Nah. Build what you want. Build what makes you happy. Build what your heart desires. And I think this is a great example of that. It still works, still looks great, some very nice stuff going on with it. Something I also really like is using a lot of older parts to reflect the fact that the Turaga himself is old. I think it's just kind of clever. It's just a nice little nod and very subtle. It just works nicely. Something I really like as well is using that Borok body piece there to sort of shape the whole of that torso. Sometimes I find it very useful if you're stuck on something, just to grab a part and just start connecting things into it. And then suddenly maybe the thing you're struggling with will kind of form around the piece, And often that's what I kind of do, even when I'm not struggling with a part, is I go, okay, well, what do I want this, let's say we're working on a leg design. How do I want this to look? And so I go, okay, well, I definitely want this armor piece to be on the front. And I go, okay, well, this has got these sort of connections. Let's just start adding some pins and all sorts of things. And then eventually you sort of shape in the rest of the limb or whatever it is you're working on. So yeah, definitely play around with that sort of stuff. And those Borok bodies actually have a lot of connection points on them. So I imagine it would be very helpful in building a torso, much like this. So, excellent work there, good sir, Mr. Jacopo. Nicely done. Anyway, that about wraps it up for all of the mocks in this episode. Like I said at the start of the episode, if you're interested in submitting some of your own mocks, you of course can. Be sure to check the links in the description where you can find some of my social media. Places like my Instagram, my Flickr, and my Facebook have personal messaging systems. The best way to submit a mock is just to chuck me a message with a link to your mock, with some photos, a name, all that jazz, and I'll put it on the list, and eventually it'll make it into the episode. Also, while you're there, be sure to check the links in the description for the mocks that you saw in today's episode, because these guys are all talented people. Be sure to check out the stuff that they've done. Anyway, that about wraps it up for this episode. Thank you very much for watching. Have fun building some Turaga in the future. Happy building. I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.